All right, let's take a deeper dive into universal life insurance. What's going to happen with universal life is that in year one, we have a pretty big expense load, right? We're setting up a relationship that could last a lifetime. There's some costs in that. But in year 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, we start seeing the expense load drop. And what that means is more money will go into the cash value of the consumer and more money in that state statutory reserve account too. So the insurance company is going to be happier, every year that goes by. They've got a little more put aside to pay that death benefit claim if it happens. The consumer is going to start getting a little more cash value. So in year 1, you're really not going to see much at all happen here. But by the end of year 2 or year 3, now you've got money going in. And with a universal life policy, you've got a minimum growth credit. So what I've modeled out is a 4% growth credit, right? And so what I've shown then is based on the assumptions of how we split the premium, what is that cash value going to do? And you can see 3 years in, you have enough cash value kind of equal to 1 premium. It doesn't always equal 3 to 1. It could be 4 to 1. But that's the idea here, is that by the end of the 3rd year, this cash value is starting. You've got a minimum crediting rate of that universal life policy. I'm going to pause for just a second on that and talk about some different types of universal products. Straight up universal life insurance has a minimum crediting rate. And the insurance company can always pay a higher crediting rate, but they at least have to pay the minimum crediting rate of that policy. That's a promise between the insurance company and the policy owner, okay? So in this case, I modeled 4%. When interest rates are higher, you get a higher promise. When they're lower, you get a lower promise. When we're coming out of big market volatility, you get a lower promise. But that's the idea, is the insurance company says, hey, we're going to give you at least 4% a year as long as you have this policy. That's like a lifetime promise. That can be a pretty valuable promise based on what that credit rating is. Now, there's 2 other kind of universal life policies that I want to talk about real quick. One is called variable universal life. So with variable universal life, throw the minimum credit out the window. Instead, you're going to pick sub-accounts. And your performance is the sub-account less fees and expenses. So let's say that you said, I want small cap growth stocks, I want bonds, and I want large cap growth stocks. And you want 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And at the end of the year, let's say you wind up with 8%. Well, then you'd get an 8% crediting rate. That's the beauty of the variable universal life policy. The risk of the variable universal life policy is, what if you have negative 10%? Well, guess what, team? Then your cash value drops negative 10%. And that's a stinker. So I find with variable universal life, there are very specific usage cases. Because generally speaking, I want the death benefit there if I die. I don't want to risk it. I don't want to risk this stuff. If I want market investments, I'll invest in the market, right? I'm not going to carry that in my insurance. There are specific uses for variable universal life. All right, I'm not a huge fan in the general marketplace. Now, the other one is called indexed universal life, or IUL. IUL kind of blends the two. IUL says there's a minimum crediting rate, 1, 0, 2%. There's some baseline. And then you throw it in an index, and so there's some top performance. So based on how the index does, you could earn up to a top amount. If the market stinks that year, then you're stuck at the lower credit rating. So this is the IUL. It's a band of returns. I struggle with IUL sometimes. That can be a very complicated equation by design. There's like daily market caps, so every day you can get some percentage of market growth. Anyway, it gets pretty complicated. I would challenge anyone selling you one to explain it to you. Right, I would push back a little on that. So tell me how this crediting rating works, because they can get real tricky. But that's how this cash value growth works, right? And so you're going to have some rate applied to the funds that grows over time. All right. Now, meanwhile, the insurance company, on the other hand, is going to have their statutory reserves. They don't have any crediting limits, so they're going to invest in bond markets, equities, private investments, hedge funds, real estate. And they've been doing great lately. So your reserves required by the state are ideally going to grow at a greater rate than what you're crediting. Yeah. So you want to grow at 9 or 10, you credit at 4. The idea there is that differential helps fuel the reserves. So then you don't have to charge as much, so more can go in cash value for policies, and you have happier insurance clients, right? So The idea here is that we're going to invest in market rates. We want to beat that guaranteed crediting rate over time. That differential surplus helps fuel the company operations and allows them to offer lower cost products. So that's kind of how this all works together. All right. So that's kind of how cash value works. I hope this is informative. And we'll do one more video on universal life where we'll dig into kind of different types of policies and the idea of net amount at risk.